Go ahead. Boulos, please remove the screen now so Dr. Atif can start. Dr. Atif, you can start, your doctor.
Start my comments?
No, start presenting Dina, just the title of the paper, and Dina will have the floor to start.
All right, perfect. Yeah, delighted. I'm glad you're all here and looking forward to a good discussion. In many respects, topical, they are informative, and they used what I would call appropriate methodology. The first paper is by Dina Atif Mandaur. It's about COVID-19 and food security challenges in the MENA region. Dina comes to us well prepared and has done incredibly good research, and I'm really happy that I had the chance to review her paper, and I look forward to a good discussion. Dina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atif, for such an introduction. I hope I will meet your expectation, though. I'll start sharing my screen right away. Okay, hopefully you can all see it. Right?
Yes, please.
Perfect. If you can make it into full screen, it would be brilliant.
Yes. Okay. So just thank you so much for giving me the chance to take part in this webinar presenting my paper. As Dr. Atif mentioned, it's related to COVID or the pandemic and food security. Basically, the main objective of the study is to understand the link between the pandemic and food security, whether the pandemic would play a role in explaining the cross-country variability in food security in general, and with special focus on the MENA region in specific. Actually, I did this through using two approaches, a descriptive one, basically focusing on understanding the main channels through which the effect would be transmitted to the food security, potentially transmitted to food security, and then doing the same, however, using a quantitative econometric methodology. The structure of the study itself, it is formed out of four sections. The first two sections are almost replicas, but with different focuses. The first is focusing on the initial. In fact, in order to understand the effect or the impact or the link between the pandemic and food security, we need to understand the initial situation of food security per se. So I did this in the first two sections. I might use the pointer if possible. In the first two sections, I did this once on the global level to understand the specific nature of such an extraordinary, unique crisis and its link, or how is it linked to food security. In addition, I made a brief review, literature review on the studies that had the same focus. And then the second one was a replica to the first, but with the focus on the MENA region itself. Then the main core, I would say, the empirical assessment regarding the link between the two variables, and then ending up with the conclusions and policy implications. For the sake of presentation, for the sake of time and the presentation, I'm always, by the way, exceeding my time limit. So please notify me whenever you feel that I did. I will quickly give a glimpse on the first two sections and then move to the third, hopefully right away. Okay. So to understand the initial situation, whether on the global level, and the same applies also on the MENA region, the food security was actually, before the outbreak of COVID, before the outbreak of the pandemic itself, the situation was not at its best. Actually, we were facing, or the world is facing, a case of a relapse after a progress for more than a decade, starting from 2015. all the indicators, food security indicators, most of the food security indicators went in the reverse direction. I won't go through the details, but just give you a glimpse on how things or how the stage was set in receiving or in confronting the COVID as a crisis. Regarding the impact of or the link between the pandemic and food security, as I said, I did a brief review, literature review. Most of the studies indicated and emphasized a significant negative relationship, whether on the household level, country level. It showed high contingency even on sectorial level, but all were in the direction of having a significant negative impact. However, the situation is not as gloomy as it seems, where I actually raised some questions in order to understand this specific nature. How are things really going on? Is it really a supply-driven crisis or a demand-driven crisis? Is it price or income-driven? What's the role of the supply chains, the value chains? Does the bottlenecks in such a chains affected or was a vital transmission channel that transmitted the effect to food security or not? Also, I discussed the main differences between this crisis and the food crisis in 2007-2008. Just to give you, I said I will go quickly on this part. At the outset, things look not as bad as I just mentioned, because, for example, from the availability side, you can see that the stock, the utilization ratio is going on to a comforting level. Even in 2021, it is going gradually in an increasing trend. So giving this comforting feeling that everything is fine and the food market is doing well is when the time came to receive such a crisis. In fact, this positive trend, we can say, attribute this positive trend to indirectly to the crisis in 2007-2008, where most of the countries, especially developing countries, as a kind of response to such a crisis, at that time, they started to follow expanding storage capacities, upgrading the storage capacities, and thus this led to this relaxed availability pillar in receiving the COVID. So that's why it seems that everything is from this pillar is going in a comforting zone. However, we should take this with a certain degree or with a good degree of prudency, where the recent forecast, the FAO forecast, is gradually retreating from such positive trends. Actually, the other way around, the utilization is increasing, the supply is decreasing. So actually, we cannot deal with it as a long-lasting. Regarding prices, also it seems to be having the first look. The FAO Food Price Index is on the downward trend in 2020, and however, looking at the details, starting from April, the prices started to rise, to take an upward trend. So again, we should not take this as a very comforting trend. We should take this with scrutiny, with a very high degree of cautiousness. For example, you can see in December 2020, the FAO Food Price Index reached extreme value compared actually to 2012. So yes, we are far below the levels in 2011 and definitely in 2007 and 2008, but still they are on the rising side. Okay. Focusing on the MENA region itself, again, the prospects are very gloomy. The region the food security in the region is almost at the edge. The region itself is amongst the world's largest food importers, each country on the average importing more than 50% of its food consumption. The region includes 2 of the top 10 countries enduring high severity of food crisis, namely Yemen and Syria, and also other countries experiencing conflict like Iraq, Palestine, and Libya. Lebanon and Turkey also include or they incorporate refugees also experiencing severe degrees of food insecurity. The GCC countries, they also, although they are at a relative better position, and I will come to this point later, they include also migrant workers. They form actually a substantial percentage of the population, exceeding 80% in the UAE and 70% in Kuwait and Qatar, for example. So those are actually suffering from food security discrimination by being not covered with the normal social security scheme as other normal citizens. Both segments, just to illustrate how their situation is really frustrating and alarming, they were named by Zoraik as the invisible martyrs of the food system, the migrant workers and the refugees. Just to outline the main triggers of food security in the MENA region, conflict, as you just saw, conflict and political instability came on top of the list, and then the relative limited arable land, where only 30% of collectively of the MENA land is suitable for agriculture. Water stress is another major challenge, where all the countries range from high to extremely high stress, water poverty or water stress. Then comes the macro imbalances, like the case of, for example, of Lebanon and the political and macroeconomic crisis that it is currently experiencing, putting so much pressure on the affordability pillar of food security. In addition to the, I can name it, the in-house problems or the endogenous variables in each country that did not succeed. The food security policies in each country did not succeed to address the radical or the deeply rooted problems in the food sector, like that they have been long suffering from, like the anti-competitive behavior, like fragmented supply chains and others, other variables, other restrictions. Bringing COVID into the picture, and again, now I'm just focusing on the MENA region, I used as a proxy, I used the indicator as a proxy for COVID, which is the COVID Readiness Risk Index. It measures actually the readiness or the preparedness of countries in terms of the coping capacity to handle the disease itself. It's actually based on the Epidemic Risk Index. It is published by the European Commission, and I found it very interesting because it's a composite index, it's a score index that encompasses various taxonomy of indicators reflecting economic, institutional, health, infrastructural deficiencies, those that can limit the ability of countries in handling the disease itself. And on the other side, I measured, or I'm just illustrating this graph using the measure for food security. I took the Global Food Security Index, which is also a composite measure published by the Economic Intelligence Unit, the European Intelligence Unit. And you can just see the negative relationship where the global food security is very low in countries experiencing very high risk in terms of their ability or the preparedness or ability to handle the disease itself. And by the way, this data is for the year was taken for the year 2019, before the outbreak of the pandemic. Just to have a look at how was the situation amid the crisis, and I have to tell you that I was facing a great deal of restriction regarding availability of data, and you can imagine, due to the novelty of the issue, and food security per se is already suffering from data insufficiency. So you can imagine this was actually a big challenge in the study. So in order to understand how was the situation amid the crisis itself, I looked at the World Hunger Map. So I just comparing the number of people with insufficient food consumption in January 2021 compared to October 2020, you can see those with arrows, upward arrows are the countries that faced increasing increase in number of people suffering from poor or borderline food consumption. Outlining the main channels of transmission of COVID to food security in the MENA region, I won't really go into detail, but I'll just mention the main two important channels. Basically, the recessionary impact due to this very strong adverse supply shock that the whole globe is experiencing through the economic downturn and consequently poverty. And the other vital channel is international trade. Quickly looking at jumping to the international trade, you can see the region, how is it very fragile and very prone to or highly exposed to fluctuations in the world market by having very high import dependency ratios reaching 100% in most of the Gulf countries and 90% in other countries in the region, making the situation highly vulnerable to adverse impact of such a crisis. As I mentioned, or I don't know if I mentioned or not, the COVID was also associated with another shock, which is the declining prices of energy prices or oil prices. We call them the twin shock of COVID and declining prices. This had actually affected countries in different. Is there anything? Should I continue?
But try to be a bit,
Okay. Should I jump then to the quantitative part? Okay. So just quickly reviewing the empirical assessment part, where I try to understand how how can the pandemic explain the cross-country variability in food security. I did actually, in order also to overcome the data restriction and how to have a broader idea of the impact, I followed two approaches. The first approach, I try to understand the link between the various country coping capacities in handling the pandemic, as I mentioned, using the COVID risk index, and from one side, and the global food security index from the other. And the other approach, I focused on assessing or understanding the link between the severity of the disease per se, in terms of the number of confirmed cases, and food insecurity in terms of the number of people suffering from insufficient food consumption. And of course, in the two approaches, MENA situation was compared to the rest of the world as defined by the various data sets. Those followed two different data sets, as I will briefly explain. In the first approach, as I mentioned, I used the composite informed COVID risk index as published in 2019, and capturing, as I mentioned, taxonomy array of various indicators to reflecting the various rigidities and weaknesses regarding demographic, economic, institutional, health infrastructure rigidities existing in the economies that could limit the ability of such countries in handling the disease. And just to give you an idea, they are lumped up into three categories or three sub-indices. I took only two indices, the hazard and exposure and lack of coping capacity. I omitted the vulnerability because it includes food insecurity within, so of course it would create a case of indigeneity, so I excluded the vulnerability sub-index. The lack of coping capacity index, just to make it clear, it includes the institutional deficiencies in general, corruption, health expenditure, public-private health expenditure, and government effectiveness, and so forth. Whereas the hazard and exposure, it reflects more the demographic aspects. Okay. As you can see from the first approach, here are the two: the hazard and exposure and the coping capacity as among the exploratory variables, the global food security index as the dependent variable. And I included other variables to to also to deprecate or to show the ability of such variables in explaining the variability of food security. Like, for example, the food affordability pillar using the GDP per capita, or the food availability using the average dietary energy supply adequacy as a proxy for food availability, food inflation to measure accessibility pillar, also the ratio of food imports to total exports, again measuring the accessibility pillar, in addition, of course, to two interactive dummy terms to see the situation or the relative situation of the MENA region regarding those two risk parameters. And the data set is constituted of covers 112 countries, and it has some limitations I won't go through now. The results showed that actually the two risk indices, the COVID-related risk indices, showed highly significant relation or link to in explaining the variability of food security in various countries. As you can see, negatively related to the food security, and the same for the MENA, also the MENA regarding hazard exposure and risk and the coping capacity. However, you can see also that the coping capacity, again, which includes the institutional restrictions and the health-related restrictions or weaknesses in the countries, had a higher impact in the MENA compared to the rest of the world as defined by this data set. The food accessibility defined by food inflation, the food affordability defined by the GDP per capita, they all had significant coefficients in the expected direction. The second approach, as I said, it tried to address the link between the intensity of the disease itself in terms of the number of confirmed cases, together with the food insecurity as measured by the number of people suffering from insufficient food consumption. And this was taken from the World Hunger Map, covering 93 developing countries and those already suffering from food insecurity in such terms. And I took the data as of the end of January 2021. Okay. The results and the rest of the data, the rest of the variables were the same like the first approach, okay? And in addition to, of course, to the interactive term to test for the relative situation of the MENA country, the MENA region. As you can see, again, the intensity of the disease showed significant relationship with the food insecurity in explaining the variability of food insecurity, the cross-sectional or the cross country variability regarding food insecurity, and the same for MENA. But however, for the MENA now, it is not in a disadvantaged situation as the previous approach, but now it's the relatively weaker situation in impact.
Dina, sorry, three more minutes because we've taken too much time.
Okay. Then I'll skip to the conclusion part. Just summing up what the paper came out with, that the situation that or the MENA countries were already facing as well as the global, as well as the whole world, were facing the COVID or the pandemic with an already very weak food insecurity situation, and the situation in MENA is more drastic, which deprived the countries from having this kind of full power to mitigate or to shield themselves from the adverse effects of the crisis. The COVID or the pandemic affected basically the affordability and utilization pillars. As you saw, or as we quickly reviewed, the availability pillar was the least affected one. Ironically, the policy responses in the MENA region was actually addressing the least problematic constraint, which is food availability, and ignoring the accessibility and utilization pillars. Through, for example, resorting to one of the measures that was resorted to in 2007-2008 by resorting to export restrictions and import facilitation, this egoistic kind of behavior in order to secure the food availability in countries. However, it showed more of harm rather than a cure. At that time, however, leading to price hikes. However, the lesson was not learned as it seems. The basic recommendations that the COVID itself is not the basic problem in itself. However, it would be quite a chance to make use of the COVID as like a magnifying loop that would highlight the problems that were deeply rooted in the food sector, and that it came now the time to address them. Like, for example, and it's a good chance, like, for example, utilization pillar. Now the COVID is a health crisis, so it's the chance to, and it's easy to address such a pillar in terms of such a health crisis. I won't go through I know I'm running out of or I already ran out of time. The impact, I was just showing that the impact is not homogeneous across all countries. The impact differs from one country to the other, where the GCC countries were the relatively least affected countries. However, still they are suffering from very deficient utilization pillar or very weak utilization pillar, having the highest obesity and diabetes rates worldwide, in addition to the migrant worker issue. I went through also testing the vulnerability of various countries being exposed to demand and supply related shocks, showing that each country has its own circumstances and how would each country be having different sources of vulnerability from different angles, jeopardizing their food security situation. Yes, so the empirical assessment also, it shifted the attention to the importance of the weaknesses in the institutional perspective, institutional framework and health expenditure and the corruption, the governance. Those had came as in the first rank, explaining the variability in food security across the whole set of data, and more also on the MENA region. In addition, if I can compare the results of the two approaches, which I know it is not eligible because they are both two different sets, but we can say that the intensity of the disease came in the third rank in importance regarding explaining the cross-country variability in food security. So yeah, just to, I know it's another, just last word, another potential area that was not utilized at all, or very minimal, negligible efforts were taken in this direction, although COVID brings up this as a very potential area, which is digitalization. It's almost not applicable. No country, no single country in the MENA region, except for very, very early steps in Egypt, took advantage of this chance that the COVID brought. However, this should be another potential area that COVID brings us to make use of within, to have better, to address better the food affordability, awareness, productivity, dissemination of information, building up new jobs. So it's the hope is in the pandemic itself, just to end it up. Sorry for exceeding my time. And thank you for your attention. I missed many points, but you can refer to the paper, or I can answer, of course, in the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Dina. Sorry we took a bit more time. Others.
I'm really sorry.
No problem. I'll try to be as concise as possible. Let me say first that I would want to commend Dina on tackling such a difficult question when the situation is still unfolding. And if for no other reason, I mean, her ability to bring insights and analysis to a unfolding situation is absolutely important. And there is nothing probably more serious consequence of the pandemic than the impact it has on food security and food availability. The issue here is multidimensional, and Dina has been able to look at it from more than one way and from one perspective. The issue is basically, it's a triple shock type of a situation. What started as a health situation migrated into becoming an economic challenge, and then it migrated into being a food issue. And all of these manifestations coming simultaneously. What is really important, and what I found quite interesting, is her ability to look at the income versus price. And that's not a minor issue. It's an important issue in the sense that the income issue is far more serious for poor countries, whereas probably the price is a mixed issue. But the fact that she has been able to distinguish between the type of impact on food the crisis has had on, say, cereals, which is consumed primarily by and more extensively by the poor, than on vegetables and meat that are to a great extent more the staples of the people with higher income. And being able to distinguish between the way the responses had come is quite interesting, in the sense that it seems like the major food crops were not affected in the same way as the other types of food, especially perishables and meat. And in this sense, there was a bit of a leeway that the poor were able to adjust to. I like very much also the fact that he has distinguished the impact on the supply availability, and then the question of affordability, which has been affected by shortages of purchasing power, and then the story of utilization, access and utilization. And these distinctions are quite important because they discriminate, in some sense, allow you to distinguish between what impact will be on the high income countries, those who have been part of the supply chain, the global supply chain and technology, and able to adjust, versus those who are not as involved, engaged, and accessible to these supply chains, world supply chains. What I really find important is also the issue of utilization ratios to normal values, showing that there is probably a distinction here that could be made, and it's an important one, between impact on demand versus impact on supply. What I am really going to concentrate, given the fact that we don't have much time and other people are waiting for us, I would like to say there are about 4 issues. And then Dina was aware of them. Actually, she mentioned a few of them. One of which is the use of cross-section data does not allow you to look at dynamic effects. And probably, in some sense, given the fact that we only have 1 year of data on the crisis, that probably this was the only alternative option available. But if you use cross-section, you deny yourself, and maybe later on, this may be possible as we have more data. First of all, you can't do any causality test. And this is important in the sense that Dina has chosen a few dependent variables, some of which look maybe to be independent variables, in the sense that in the absence of a causality test or ability to conduct causality test, it's quite difficult to really know what is the dependent and what's the independent value. The other aspect, which is also important here, is that she used 2 approaches. The World Hunger Map, I find it a little bit constraining, in the sense that you're only looking at people who are already suffering hunger. It doesn't give you the chance to look at those who don't and those who do, and to be able to look at differences in the responses and the impacts that they would have to contend with. There are also a number of minor issues that could come from the fact that you're using a type of regression that maybe alternatives could have been there, especially in the sense that she looked at some of the external variables that are influencing this. But there are so many other control variables that probably are left without control. Income distribution within and between countries, different shocks in terms of the elasticities, whether it's price or income, and how these would filter into the system. But on the whole, what I really found here is that given the topical nature of the subject, given the shortages of data, given the severity of the issue, given the fact that different countries would really deal with this differently, she's done an excellent job of trying to trace the impact, gauge the sensitivity. I thought the fact that she has to deal with the MENA region as a group rather than on an individual basis, you lose the variety that could come from the fact that different countries have so many different specificities that would be important determinant of how the crisis is unfolding. But on the whole, I think it's an excellent paper. I enjoyed it very much. I would have liked it to be a little bit more concise. I would really have, expectation that with more data, she might be able to look at it from not only a cross-sectional, but pooling cross-section and time series, so she would get a much richer type of results. And I would very much also like to see that she considers alternative dependent variables rather than the ones that she has chosen, because this would really give us a richer picture of how this COVID-19 crisis unfolding and continues to unfold, and in the way it would have affected different countries in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very rich, detailed insights. I appreciate all of them. And you know that the main problem, like for example, using other dependent variables, the problem with food security is really the availability of data is very limited. And for example, I was thinking at one moment the World Hunger Map to look at the monthly data in order to implement the time series analysis, but again I couldn't get except like 3 months or something. So it was almost it would have been also meaningless. So I know the restrictions, and that's why I wrote the limitations in the study, because I feel like a little bit tied with the sources that I have. So that's the I can say that was the best I could do using such limited resources. However, definitely the causality test could. I mean, I can try to implement such a test to enrich the analysis, to think about more control variables, and yeah. Thank you so much for all your comments, and yeah, I really appreciate it.
I know,
Shireen,
Shireen, are we able to discuss things now, or shall we move to the other papers?
I think there are 2 questions in the Q&A section. If Dina can... Hello?
Can we discuss all of these at the end? We have 3
yes,
papers
or I was
discuss.
just going to suggest if Dina would like to start responding to them in the Q&A session, she can do that as we move on to the following session. Okay.
Okay.
And now After special thanks to Dina and Dr. Kobrusi, we're moving on to the next paper on the long-term macroeconomic effects of climate change, evidence from the MENA region. The paper is by Yasmina Abdel Fattah, Amal Abdel Fattah, Hala Abu Ali, and Henia Abdel Latif. And with that, we give the floor to Dr. Aida, who, if she'd like to add anything, if not, we can move to our speaker to start the presentation on the paper.
Yes, I would like just to add, we go with 3 papers in the row, and I will discuss them at the end. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Today we are discussing a very important topic. This paper is studying the effect of that goes from the climate change to economic growth in the MENA region. And we will start by looking at what's going on first. Like global warming is quantified through temperature and precipitation, and let's see how the MENA region's temperature is functioning. And as you can see here, we have temperature anomalies from its historical norms from 1980 till 2017. And as you can see, we have a positive trend, and this positive trend supports the idea that climate change is evolving over time, and it's affecting the MENA countries or the MENA region. And if we move to the MENA country spatial temperature rise, and this is the average increments over the years from 1980 to 2017. And as you can see here, the Gulf countries, most of them, they are badly affected by the temperature rise, as well as Morocco and Algeria. And here in Egypt, we have around the delta and actually the Nile River, which most of the Egyptians live. So this means that we are suffering, the MENA region is suffering from, is one of the heaviest regions that suffer from the climate change. And this is through heat waves, temperature rise, a changing pattern of precipitation, or decreasing the precipitation in some cases, sea level rise, and thereby we have shortage in water supply, which we are suffering a lot in the many countries. So this global warming, I would say, is threatening the macroeconomic variables, and including, as we say, economic growth. So if we would like to see the current situation for the MENA countries and the international treaties for climate change, we have the Paris Agreement, and through Paris Agreement, we have nationally defined the MENA countries, they are divided with respect to these NDCs. For the GCC countries, they are not committed, and they have unconditional they are not providing unconditional commitment to these indices. For the North African countries, except for Egypt, they have some sort of unconditional commitment. We have Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. They have commitment to some sort of carbon emissions and global warming emissions reduction. So this is the current situation, and if we would like to build more, we want to discuss the literature that has been discussing the global warming and the climate change. It's very evolving since 1980. Especially we have used most recent research that has been done, especially in 2019, where they examined the long-term impact of climate change on economic activity in 174 countries from the period 1960 to 2014, and they have used a stochastic growth model. In this is a panel data set. For another kind of studies that has been done, they have used the impact of weather on GDP components, and another set of studies has been done on, for example, Africa, Vietnam. Most of all of these studies show that there is a negative relationship between temperature and GDP growth. So the aim of our study is to examine to build on the literature that has been working on climate change, especially that the MENA region is very scarce on this matter, and we would extensively see the impact of climate change risk on economic growth in the short run and in the long run. So we would like to answer the question how climate change is affecting the macroeconomic aspects in the MENA region. So how do we done our study or our analysis, econometric analysis? We have, this is like the part that it took so much time to work on, because the data is economic aspects. So we have economic data, and as well as we have climate data. So the climate data that we have used is satellite images of temperature in Celsius and precipitation in millimeter, and they were averaged to get, and we use population weighted population density, and it is gridded population density for 2010, and this was incorporated into our empirical estimation using the deviation from the historical norms. For the macro indicators, we got the data from the IMF, the World Bank. So we have investment rate, inflation rate, FDI, government expenditure, as well as policy index to measure the institution quality. So we actually have a set of macroeconomic variables as well as climate indices. So we use these two group of different set of variables to see how the stochastic growth model for 20 MENA countries from 1980 to 2017, how the climate change as well as the other macroeconomic indicators will affect the economic growth. So this is the summary statistics that we got for these countries. And if we look at the temperature versus the GDP per capita, we can see that we have a negative relationship between temperature and GDP per capita. And we have, as you can see, we have two groups. Group 4, these are the GCC countries, the one in blue, and these are the non-GCC countries. So you can see that they have, the GCC countries, they have a higher slope because they have higher GDP per capita and a higher temperature. So they are more affected by the temperature and the climate change than the rest of the MENA countries. So our empirical strategy starts by the standard panel data estimations, including fixed effect and random effect. And then we have the data dimension where T is greater than N. So we thought of having a panel co-integration, and we estimate in order to estimate the long run relationship. So in order to do this, we have to test for unit root through using a panel unit root tests, different ones. And then we go and do panel co-integration tests. And finally, we estimated our long-run model by using group mean panel fully modified ordinary square. Oops. Model that we have used, where we have Y is our economic growth, and X includes the macroeconomic variables as well as the temperature and precipitation, which measures the climate change. And these are the well-known econometric panel unit root tests, panel unit root co-integration tests, the long-run method, and these are the empirical results. And as you can see, we have done the fixed effect and the random effect, and we have 4 different specifications. The first specification, we have temperature, investment, inflation, and government spending, and all of them, as you can see, is significant. The temperature is having a negative significant relationship with economic growth, and the other macroeconomic indicators, they support the growth models theory. If we go to the precipitation, we like in the second model specification, we drop for temperature and we have taken precipitation. Precipitation is throughout the different models is positive, but it's insignificant. And I believe that would be true for the region, because we already have scarce rainfall. We have aridity, so precipitation we wouldn't think it would be a significant variable in our growth model. It's only significant in the random effects. In order to proceed for the long run, we have the panel unit root tests. We have done these 3 tests, and the LLC, the IPC, the IPS, both of them, they have conflicting results. But for the hard Z, which the H note is there is no unit root against, we have unit root sorry. It's all the panels are stationary. Against it's not stationary, so we reject the results in the variables. All of our variables, they are non-stationary. That's why we can proceed to co-integration tests. In the co-integration test, the tests show that we have co-integrating variables that supports our long-run relationship between economic growth and the climate change variable, as well as the macroeconomic indicators. These are the models that we have estimated for the long run. The results is very coinciding with the short run results from the fixed effect and the random effect. So we support that the climate change has an adverse impact on economic growth through different channels. And this is very clear for the 20 MENA countries over the period from 1980 to 2017. So we have short run, long run effect. We have to, as a governments and policymakers, we have to design policies to mitigate the effects, which we are pretty sure that we're having these effects in the short run and on the long run. And as we can see that we have, if a temperature diverge by 1% degree annually, the long-term economic growth will be lowered by a range from 0.04 to 0.9 percentage points per year. It's a huge impact, and the results, these values depend on the method of the estimation and the macroeconomic variables that we have taken into consideration. So our aim in seeing the climate effect risk on economic growth has been achieved. The results provide some the results urge policy and regulator to adapt for climate change risk and to incorporate with it the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So our final recommendation, and that's what we are working right now with my research team, is to find the relationship between economic growth and climate change, including exogenous shocks like COVID-19 and other macroeconomic shocks. We are having quarterly series for most of the MENA countries. I hope I have you have enjoyed my presentation, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ida, would you like to actually have the discussants' comments after the two other papers?
Yes, we go with paper presentation if it's okay. We can move to the next paper and then I come back to discussion all three together. It doesn't matter for me, any preference here.
So should,
okay, we move to Dr. Jawad Saleh-Esfahani for their paper on the impact of rural electrification on education of women in rural Iran. Yes, please, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ida, and the organizers of this conference. I should begin with two apologies. Number one, that if you came to this panel for political economy or resource economics, the paper seems irrelevant. is about electrification and education. And also, I want to apologize to Ida and to others that I'm not presenting the paper as I submitted. There was two parts to it. We looked at electrification's impact on education, that is literacy as well as fertility, and we decided that the two were kind of disjoint. So, and also because time is short, I'm only presenting the results on literacy. Okay, so this paper is joint with Dr. Sara Tapatalab of Christopher Newport University, and you should have my slides now, correct? All right, so I will do a quick introduction, followed by data, some discussion of our methodology, and then the results. So the first question is, what is the relationship between economic development and electrification on the one hand and female empowerment? The first point is that evidence abounds that economic development promotes female empowerment. There are papers, several papers, but the most important of which are Duflo's paper and Jayachandran's paper that show economic development and the different ways in which economic development affects or promotes female empowerment. Economic development is often coincident with provision of electricity. And this is one of the channels by which economic development affects female empowerment. So we are going to look at how investment in this particular kind of infrastructure is related to female empowerment. And what we're going to find is that when electricity reaches a village, it has a positive effect on the literacy rate of men and women, but the impact is greater on women's literacy, so that the gap is reduced. So we have a lot of evidence from many sources that electrification improves education, but there's less evidence that it also impacts or promotes female empowerment by increasing women's education faster than men's. So this is what we will be showing here, is that electrification contributes to the narrowing of the gender gap in Iran. This is a particularly interesting finding in the context of the Islamic Revolution and Islamic Republic of Iran, because many expected that the rollback of women's rights and the setback of women's empowerment would not result in a narrowing of the gender gap in education. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to look at different policies that the Islamic Republic had. On the one hand, the rollback of women's status, giving divorce rights to husbands, also including discouraging them in the early years from seeking jobs outside the home. But at the same time, they did something that seemed very populist, very revolutionary, which is to extend electrification and other basic services to rural areas very fast, basically reversing the urban bias of the Shah's development policies. So by doing these things, they perhaps in an unintended way promoted female empowerment. So that's, I think, the contribution of this paper. First of all, this is a graph that shows this female empowerment, at least one dimension of it. This is average years of schooling of men and women, rural and urban, by year of birth. This vertical line is birth year in 1970. Cohorts born after this year are taking advantage of this changing environment in rural areas. As a result, you see female education in rural areas is rising faster than male education, and they kind of close the gap by now. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, investment in rural infrastructure, especially electrification, became a top priority. And as I mentioned, it reversed the urban bias of the Shah's government. Before the revolution, the share of rural population with electricity was only 3.7% and increased to 14.2% by 1976. And it accelerated after the revolution, going from 42% in 1984 to 86% and 100% in 2006. And if you are interested in the gap only, you see that the gap in literacy between the gender gap in literacy the rural-urban gap in electrification increased. This is the rural bias, or I guess urban bias before the revolution, increased from 65% percentage points in 1966 to 80% in 1976, because urban electrification was expanding faster than rural electrification. After the revolution, this changed. So the gap in electrification fell from 57 percentage points in 1984 to 20.6 in 1996. And this is one of the years that we study. And we also study what happens in 2006, but 2006, the gap had gone to 0. This is a table that shows the number of villages that had access to electricity. And here again, you see a very slow increase before the revolution from 1.5% of villages electrified to about 6%, and then going much faster to 22%, 38, and eventually 91%. What do we do in this paper? We use the variation in the timing of extension of electricity to about 11,500 villages to identify the impact of electrification on village level gender gap in adult literacy. And by adult, we mean men and women 15 to 49 years old. We do the same for fertility in a companion paper, which was half of the paper that we had submitted. So what we do is to estimate the impact of electrification with two different methodologies. One is triple differencing, which is differences between treated and untreated over time and between men and women. And we also do instrumental variables. The instrument variables is necessary sometimes because it's very hard to control for parallel trends when you do double or triple differencing. In other words, some villages may be on a faster track to increase women's education than others, and that could be confused with the impact of arrival of electricity. So to see if the results are robust to this kind of potential bias, we also use instrumental variables. Here we use a well-known instrument which is correlated with the cost of electrification, and that is elevation from the sea level. And in this case, we use elevation from the center of a district. So if a village is higher or lower by a significant amount from the center of the city, presumably where electricity is generated, then it's less likely to receive electricity. And so this is an instrument for the years of access to electricity, because we don't know if the years of access were exogenously set. What do we find? We find that electrification helped increase literacy, which is not surprising at all. But more importantly, and perhaps even surprisingly, it narrowed the gender gap in literacy, meaning it had a bigger impact on female literacy than on male literacy. And we also find the same results when we use instrumental variables. What's our data like? We had initially data on some 45,000 villages over time. That's how we measure the timing of arrival of electricity, but only 11,500 villages come with more complete data. It's very hard to get village level literacy rates in Iran. Basically, you have to ask the statistical agency to run the sample for a census and tell you what is the literacy rate or fertility rate, child woman ratio, that is, for a village in Iran from 2 censuses, which is what we did. So we have 11,500 villages, and we picked these villages because they had data, but also because they were nodes in healthcare delivery. When they did the healthcare plan in Iran, they would pick a village that would receive the health clinic, and then it would serve other villages as which were considered satellite villages. So these are the villages that we are studying. In triple D regressions, we have fewer villages because we had to drop villages that had electricity before 1986, because our design is to study villages that didn't have electricity in 86 and got electricity later, to see what happened to their literacy rates for men and women, and also to their fertility in the companion paper. So we have information on a bunch of other variables that I will not go into. These are whether the village had primary school, middle school, high school, what kind of roads it has, asphalt, and so on. Topography, whether it's a mountainous village or village in the plain or it's a forest region, whether it's primarily Sunni or Shia, the size of its population, whether it had TV coverage, and so on. And the elevation, of course, is the instrument that we use. I'm going to not present any summary statistics because there isn't really any time, but I'll show you this informative graph which shows the distribution of villages by female and male literacy and treatment status. You can easily see here that villages that had treatment, these two graphs on the right column, had a bigger shift in the red line for women. If you see it, women had greater education as shown by the shift of the distribution of this red line from the left to the right. What you cannot tell is whether this relative shifts in these distributions is greater or smaller for male versus female. Females are on the top, males are on the bottom, and for that we have to do more careful work, which is what we do with triple differencing and with IV. So we posit that the literacy rate in village I is determined by a host of characteristics, which I just mentioned, only some of which are observable, like population size, terrain, district, etc. And as well as access to electricity, which is the treatment, right? So here we have the X beta, X gamma, and then we have delta TI. But then there is a host of other things. Here we have identified 3 unobservable characteristics of these villages. Alpha I is an unobservable village fixed effect. Some villages maybe for whatever reason be more interested in female education or in education in general than others. Theta T is a period effect. You know, something happened in 96 that was different from 86. And then there is this thing here that really is the reason why we do the triple differencing, because double differencing gets rid of alpha and theta. If you have a time varying fixed effect, these are villages that are on a faster track for increasing literacy, for example, then they don't get eliminated when you do double differencing. And you hope that when you do triple differencing, it gets eliminated. Why? Because it doesn't have an index for gender, which is the, this, actually this should be IT and not JT. So this is specific to a village. And when you do it, if it's the same, this parallel trend thing has to be the same for male and female. If it's different for them, then again, it doesn't work. Then you have still parallel trends assumption unfulfilled. But if there's something there, like villages that are more enlightened, if you like, and they don't discriminate between men and women, then you have a trend that is faster in one village than another, but it's the same for male and female. That gets eliminated here. So this is not something to really look at and learn a whole lot. This is just telling you a standard triple difference in equation. So I'm going to go quickly to the IV method. The IV basically says that electricity provision is related to elevation. And I'm going to show in a second that that is the case. And so if you get the predicted value of the timing of electrification or the years of exposure, then you can put it in this equation and estimate beta without bias. So the first thing is the first stage regressions that show the validity of the instrument. In column 1 for 1996 and column 2 for 2006, we see that elevation of a village affects the timing of electricity. The higher the elevation relative to the center of the district, the later the arrival of electricity. And of course, by 2006, you also have this negative effect, and it's a little larger. We do control for all variables that I mentioned before, availability of schools and mosques, terrain, TV, etc. All right, now moving on, I just have a few slides to show you the level of the estimates. So the triple differences for 1996, what has happened by 1996 is that this is the coefficient of interest. 74 per thousand is the reduction in the gap in literacy. Obviously, male have a higher literacy rate, as you can see in the row above. The treatment and control villages are not exactly the same. When we add controls in column 2, the difference, which is this row here, drops from 0.056 to 0.017, which is good. And post is the change in literacy rates from 86 to 96. So here we do have a verification that female literacy rates increase faster than male. If you take the end year to 2006, you see the same things. You see that the average increase in literacy was 518 per thousand, and that male literacy exceeded female literacy on average, but the gap shrank. Of course, by 2006, the gap should have shrunk more, 0.093. Moving on to the IV, so we shifting methodology. We're going to see if we use the elevation of the village as an instrument for the timing of electricity, whether we see a similar result that we saw before. So here we see years of exposure in a regression in which female literacy rate is the dependent variable. The OLS results are clearly different from 2SLS. So instrumenting for arrival of electricity obviously matters. And the results are when you do for controls on the second column here, that every year 17 per thousand is a reduction in the gap, in the literacy gap. And if you multiply that by 10 years, it's quite substantial. If I move to 2006, this is when we are allowing the time to extend to 2006. And again, the 2SLS results show about 100 per thousand reduction. And this is for female literacy. This is not the gap. So for female literacy, because we have to do male and female separately. When we do for male, we see the coefficients are much smaller. For here we have, for example, 17 per thousand for female. Here we have 10 per thousand for men in 96. We have 5 per thousand for men till 2006. If we difference the two and make the dependent variable the gender gap in literacy, we find that there is a reduction of 8 per thousand per year. So 8 times 10 years, you got about 80 per thousand, which is very close to the 74 per thousand that we found from the triple D. So I'm persuaded, we are persuaded that there is not a whole lot of bias in our control for the placement of electricity. If you go to 2006, now you have 20 years, every year 6 per thousand. So you got more substantial, but the results are very similar to the triple D. A little bit greater reduction in the gap for the IV than triple D, but not big enough to suggest that the triple D results are highly biased. So just the last slide, as expected, we found electrification increases literacy rates for both men and women, but that the increase is greater for women than men, which reduces the gender gap, which we believe is what is an important element of female empowerment. And the IV estimates of impact confirm those of the triple D, but are slightly larger. I'm stopping here and returning the control to ERF. Thank you very much for your patience. Dr. Tagba Talab is on the panel, and she may help with the answering of your questions later on.
Thank you very much. On to you, Dr. Ida, or shall we just move on to our third paper, assessing the impact of irrigation on Kurdish separation in Southeastern Turkey by Oli Ballinger. And then we can take Dr. Ida's discussant's comments.
Thank you.
All right. Shall I just go for it? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. First of all, thanks for the presentation so far. They've been very informative, and actually you'll be seeing a lot of sort of methodological similarities between my paper and the previous one that we just heard from. So let me just get started because there's quite a lot of material to get through. My project seeks to identify the impact of a large-scale irrigation scheme on insurgent recruitment and conflict in southeastern Turkey. And I'll start by giving a little bit of context as to why I chose to ask this question. But first, let's take a look at the conflict that we're talking about in this case. This is the Kurdish ethnic minority in southeastern Turkey, though there are distributions in many of the neighboring regions in Iran, Iraq, and Syria as well. In the Turkish region that has the highest concentration of Kurds, there happens to also be very high levels of poverty. So here we see that 44% of the population in southeastern Turkey is living on less than $1 a day, as per a report in 2007. And this has led to the ideological character of many of the Kurdish insurgent groups being distinctly socialist, because the Kurdish identity question then becomes framed in terms of regional economic inequalities. And crucially, because of the agrarian nature of this region in Turkey, the Pkk began as a predominantly peasant movement, recruiting largely from farming communities. So at the same time, we have an agrarian region that is also very drought prone, very arid. Income is rain limited very frequently. But at the same time, we have the Turkish government embarking on a massive regional development program focused on the provision of water and electricity. So I'm focusing here on irrigation because this is sort of the primary livelihood in this region, is agriculture, and the receipt of irrigation has quite transformative effects on farmers' ability to grow high yield and high value crops such as cotton. And the income gains associated with the switch from subsistence farming to irrigated agriculture in this region appear to be between 3- and 7-fold in some cases, according to certain estimates. But beyond these sort of technical goals of building 19 dams, 22 hydropower plants, and 1.8 million hectares of irrigation, there were also quite explicit social goals entailed by this project. The Turkish government hoped that this would help alleviate some of the resentment felt by the Kurdish community towards the Turkish state. Now, this being the 21st century, you no longer have to take my word for it. Here we have a leaked WikiLeaks cable by the US government, by the US embassy in Ankara, written after extensive interviews with members of the Turkish government, including then President Abdullah Gül, that says, a quote that bears reading in its entirety. Most government of Turkey officials believe that greater focus on economic and social development in Turkey's southeast will have the greatest impact, positive impact on ethnic Kurds' views towards the Turkish state. If Kurds are gainfully employed, have better educational opportunities, and see increased levels of infrastructure development throughout their region, their affinity for the terrorist PKK will wane further. A top priority is ensuring the completion of the massive Southeastern Anatolia project within 5 years. So here we see a quite explicit expectation on the part of Turkish government officials that this massive irrigation project would reduce the appeal of Kurdish separatist groups. And indeed, ethnographic evidence collected during the height of the conflict does suggest anecdotally that there does appear to be a transformative effect of receiving irrigation on farmers' views of the state. So here we see the construction of the Atatürk Dam and the consequent filling of the reservoir, and the irrigation of the Haran and Suruç irrigation schemes. And quotes from farmers indicate that this has a quite transformative effect on how they perceive the state. One farmer said, "Our view of the state changed positively. We had hatred before, but now they started investing in the southeast. We did not trust the state before, but it brought electricity, water, phone, etc. And now we trust the state a lot. At last, the state has turned its face towards us." You get the idea. Conversely, one farmer who did not receive irrigation, but was located close to an irrigation scheme, is quoted as saying, "Why should I not support PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan?" So this gives us sort of a flavor of the impact that the receipt of irrigation in this sort of arid, predominantly agrarian region of Turkey has on individuals' views of the Turkish state, the primary adversary of the PKK, the Kurdish insurgents. So this paper assesses the impact of state-provided irrigation on conflict incidents and insurgent recruitment in southeastern Turkey. And I'll just go into the main findings really quickly. I'll expand on these in a bit towards the end, but briefly, irrigation is persistently negatively related to conflict incidents and recruitment. This is robust to several alternative specifications, including 4 different measures of irrigation, 2 different conflict data sets, and a highly detailed Pkk recruitment data set. Panel models indicate that a 27-kilometer-square increase in irrigated area leads to a 49% drop in the probability of a conflict incidence. And cross-sectional IV models suggest that a fully irrigated 25 square area is 58% less likely than the average cell to experience a conflict event involving Kurdish rebels during the 2016 to 2019 period. So here we see actually quite similar results despite them being derived from very different methods. So a brief outline of what's to come. I've just given you a brief introduction, and now I'm going to go through data collection, empirical strategy, and results before concluding. So on to data collection. Here we have a superimposition of some of the key variables in this analysis. So here we have the region in question, Southeastern Anatolia, the regions covered by this infrastructural development project. Here we have major cities indicated in red and urban land cover as well. And the green indicates irrigated area. This is derived using satellite imagery, a little more on that in a second. And these black dots briefly indicate PKK, the birthplaces of PKK recruits, which I'll also expand on in a second. So the main conflict variables, these are the dependent variables in all cases, are derived from two main conflict data sets, the UCDP data set and the ACLED data set. Both have a quite extensive histories in economics. They're the most widely used conflict data sets. ACLED, slightly more detailed, but only available more recently. UCDP, available for a much longer period, hence its use in the longitudinal analysis. And in all cases, conflict is measured in binary terms as the absence or presence of a conflict event. This follows the convention in the recent literature on conflict incidents. Here we just have a brief spatial distribution of conflict events. We can see clustering sort of in the eastern portion of the study region. PKK recruitment data was derived from an APSR paper published by Güneş Murat Tezgür, who is a Kurdish academic. This is derived from internal PKK documents, and we can see the spatial distribution of recruitment events closely matching the spatial distribution of conflict events. Onto irrigation, the primary independent variable. This is derived from NASA's Landsat satellites, and there are several different measures of irrigation used here. We can see that the progression of irrigation is different in different areas of the study region, depending on where they derive irrigation from. So here we see Kızıltepe, which receives irrigation right around 1996 as a result of the Atatürk Dam, which I showed you before, being completed. However, areas such as Suruç are receiving irrigation far later, towards the 2010s, and being characterized by a more sort of steep increase. And then areas such as Viranşehir displaying a more sort of steady upward progression in terms of irrigation. In all cases, this is how the irrigation variable is derived. This is a 1-year loop of the vegetation index in Southeastern Anatolia. We can see during the summer months, the general vegetation receding and irrigation schemes becoming much more clearly visible. Another important covariate is rainfall, for obvious reasons, which I won't go into. Nighttime lights, a very important control variable for several reasons, both in terms of population density, but also in terms of measuring development over time. So here, one of the main properties of nighttime lights in terms of its use in economics and development studies is its strong correlation with development indicators. So here I correlate log night lights with district level literacy in Turkey, and it's quite a tight distribution, as more luminous areas display much higher rates of literacy. This also kind of aligns with the findings that we had in the previous study. So another very important dimension of this is the political dimension. So in order to not neglect the political economy of the region, I scraped over 3 million ballot box level election results. And here we can see the spatial distribution of these results, some ballot boxes within 200 meters of each other, allowing for an extremely high resolution map of the sort of political leanings of this area. Population data derived from voting registration data at the ballot box level, allowing for extremely high resolution population data as well. And another key element of the political economy captured by this political data is the presence of Kurdish tribes. And this is extremely important, as tribes have allied with either the Turkish government to act as paramilitaries, sort of paramilitary vanguards against the PKK, or in some cases, tribes allying with the PKK and several of the founding members of Kurdish tribes, of the PKK being from prominent Kurdish tribes as well. And we can identify Kurdish tribes through their use of what is called Birleşik Oy, which means combined voting, a practice in which villages vote en masse for the party chosen by the chieftain. And so here I have an example of a ballot box clearly displaying this tribal block voting behavior. We have 0 votes for Erdogan's AKP, 0 votes for the MHP, 0 votes for any party except the HDP, basically, where we see 154 consecutive votes for one party, one stray vote for I party, but this could be the visiting election official. In any case, even in an extremely sort of pro-HDP stronghold, this is still highly anomalous, 154 consecutive votes for one party, but this does align with what we know about sort of tribal voting behavior in this region. So if we map out ballot boxes that display this type of tribal block voting, we get a map that also aligns quite closely with the Pkk recruitment variable being clustered in the eastern portion of the region. And sort of right-leaning tribes allied with the AKP, displayed in red here, clustered in the left, in the sort of western portion of the study region. Additional controls, I won't spend much time on, but onset of the Syrian civil war, capturing conflict spillovers, ceasefire periods, as well as slope and elevation. So the empirical strategy, very quickly, I do a panel OLS model with spatial and serial corrections and a spatial Durbin model estimated via maximum likelihood. And then I also, so these are panel models. And then here I have a spatially autoregressive instrumental variables approach as well. So in both cases, I use a spatial weighting, two different spatial weighting matrices to account for spatial dependence and spillovers. Here we can see the effect of spatially weighting, for example, the irrigation variable using a contiguity matrix and an inverse distance matrix. Briefly, the outline of the spatial Durbin model, we have the lagged drought index, the main independent variable, which is irrigation in a given cell in a given year. All of our cross-sectional controls, time period controls, a one-year lag of the dependent variable to account for sort of serial correlation in conflict incidence. And here we have the spatially lagged set of these variables as well. And we also have district time trends and year fixed effects. So there's also sort of a concern of endogeneity in terms of irrigation investments. You know, the places that receive irrigation may also be politically connected, have higher potential agricultural productivity, et cetera. So to remedy this, I rerun the models only using areas that eventually become treated, that eventually receive irrigation at some point during the study period. Then the spatially autoregressive instrumental variables approach focuses on a cross-section of the conflict in the modern period from 2016 to 2019. And this model includes irrigation instrumented with topography, the previously mentioned cross-sectional controls, and then spatially lagged control variables, the dependent variables, and the error term. So quickly, the instrument for the irrigation variable is altitude. Here I display quickly the relationship between this instrument, altitude, and observed irrigation. So altitude is shown in red here. The dam is circled by this box, and blue is observed irrigation. We see a very tight relationship between areas that are below the dam, indicated in red, and areas that are irrigated. Here we see that on the whole, for the entire study region, quite a close relationship. Areas that are sort of lower are areas that are irrigated. Low flat areas are also the irrigated areas. So very quickly on the results, we see that irrigated crops such as cotton are far less sensitive to rainfall shocks. Here we see a rainfall shock in 2008 that absolutely devastates crop yields for lentils, barley, hazelnuts, and wheat, which are largely unirrigated. Here we still see a dip in terms of cotton yields, but it is far more modest than the dip from the other variables. And here we see that when irrigation is introduced, in this case in 2015, there's a massive switch from all other crops towards irrigated cotton. So the effects that this has on conflict, as shown here, is that the post-irrigation period, and again, because irrigation is phased in at different times in different parts of the study area, we exploit sort of the timing of irrigation here, and we see that the post-irrigation period is consistently marked by lower levels of conflict incidence, and that's including a very comprehensive battery of political, economic, and climatic variables. This is also robust to alternate measures of irrigation, including irrigated area rather than binary sort of pre-post irrigation, as well as years since irrigation. Now, while the marginal absolute, the absolute marginal effects of irrigation appear small here, often less than 1%, it's important to remember that the baseline probability of experiencing conflict in a given cell year is also very low. It's roughly 1.8%. So when we look at a cell in the top quartile of irrigated area, so receiving 38 square kilometers of irrigation over the whole period, we would expect a 56% decrease in the relative likelihood of experiencing a recruitment event, and a 69% decrease in the likelihood of experiencing a conflict incidence. Here we have quickly the results of the cross-sectional model. This is the instrumental variables approach. And we see that in all cases with a binary contiguity matrix and an inverse distance matrix, log irrigated area is negatively related to conflict incidence. This is, using topography as an instrument for irrigation. And when we disaggregate conflict into its components, so here we have Pkk attacks, military raids, and protests, we see that the strongest effect is actually in military raids. So raids by the government targeting villages and neighborhoods that are seen to be materially supporting the Pkk. So a fully irrigated area, according to the cross-sectional models, is 58% less likely than the average cell to experience a conflict event involving Kurdish rebels during this period. This effect is quite consistent in terms of its magnitude to the results from the panel model. And the effect is strengthened when the dependent variable is restricted to isolate military raids targeting areas perceived to be supporting the Pkk. Here we have a variety of robustness checks, which I would be happy to elaborate on in the further questions. And I'm going to skip now to the conclusions because I am horrendously over time. But in general, this paper presents a methodological contribution in terms of the aggregation of a detailed array of political and economic covariates to control for the complex sort of political economy of this region, as well as empirical contributions. In the Turkish context, the effect of this project on the conflict with the Pkk has been the subject of considerable debate, yet there is currently no actual analysis of the effect of this development project on the conflict with the Pkk. So with that, I leave you and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Since it is my turn to discuss these papers, let me just share my screen. Oh, no. Just give me a second, please. I would like to thank you, the organizers of the session and presenters. We had a very good papers and even better presentations. They covered very well. And I know we are out of time. We don't have much time. I will be quick on my notes. Just let me just give me a second. Yeah, I start with the paper. Basically, I go with the order of the papers that they were presented. They're looking at the impact of climate change on long-term macroeconomic variables in MENA countries. Looking at using climate variables, irregular precipitation, basically looking at the precipitation and temperature change. This is a very important issue. We know MENA countries are dealing with the consequences of climate change. It is affecting precipitation. It is affecting especially agricultural sectors. The paper uses the data from 1980 to 2017, very good methodology, very comprehensive work using panel data, fixed and random effect, concluding Bitcoin aggregations. The variables they use, I think they do a very good job on the climate data, but when it comes to macroeconomic data, they have several variables that they are relevant when it comes to macroeconomic factors, but when they use them all together and looking at the result, we might need some justifications of why those variables are used and what is the impact. When it comes to the result, they show correctly the negative relationship between temperature and economic growth. Government spending, availability of credit, and quality index all has positive impact on economic growth. But when it comes to impact of inflation, even including inflation variables in the equation, for me was not clear and was not justified, because the inflation variable they use is GDP deflator. And on the dependent variable, they do have, I assume they do have real GDP. And when they are using GDP deflator as independent variable, we are going to have interaction between these variables. And I think the result they see, the positive significant impact, both in the short run and in the long run, again, from my point of view, is questionable. They need to dig in, double check that, and check their model. My suggestion is using money supply if they want to capture monetary policy impact there, and they might get a better result there. The paper starts very strong with literature review. The modeling is good. The methodology is good, but they need to add to interpretation and better explanation of the result. I would like to suggest that the concluding remark needs to be based on the result, based on the significant result, not just the signs. And also I would like to suggest, when it comes to GDP growth, they use non-oil GDP. That way they take the impact of change in oil price and oil revenue from the equation. Just moving to the second paper, Shireen, do you want I just continue with the second, or we want answers? Okay, I continue with the second, and at the end we let presenters to discuss. The second paper was rural electrification's impact on empowerment of women in rural area in Iran. A very good paper when it comes to methodology, when it comes how it is the model and the statistical work. It covers 1986, 1996 census data. As Jawad mentioned, the paper I read and the paper actually presented was different because it had fertility variable in it, but overall it was the same methodology, and as I said, very good paper when it comes to statistics and methodology and how it is exercised. And the result shows that electrification has increased literacy rate, and especially when it comes to impact on female literacy. Now, in regard to my assessment about the paper, Even the motivation, just checking on the impact of revolution on women empowerment and the impact of electrification, even I agree. But things have changed so much during last 40 years. When it comes to literacy rate, when it comes to female empowerment, there are many other factors that much more, from my point of view, are much more important to pay attention. As the authors mentioned in the beginning, that literacy rate has backtracked when it comes to what's happening in Iran. And I think my suggestion is, this is a good paper, but it can benefit of adding some historical view and what has happened meanwhile when it comes to the changes in female literacy rate in Iran. And when it comes to looking at the regions, they have included religious variables, but I would like to mention it will be beneficial to add other cultural and ethnic variables. Even just including having TV as a representation of economic well-being. Maybe I don't know how much the data is available, using some variables that captures income per capita or the overall well-being, the differences, because we do have very big differences when it comes to economic conditions in rural Iran, when it comes to the north, south, west, and east. And finally, again, it is a good paper, good methodology, good execution of statistical work, but I would like to bring it, if they can, bring it to today's Iran and look at it from those lenses. And finally, the last but not the least, a very good paper on the impact of irrigation on Kurdish separatism in Southeastern Turkey. Again, very good paper, very good empirical work. I do have some notes here, so I don't want to repeat what the presenter did very good way explaining all methodology and data. They found a strong negative relationship in regard to the conflict and irrigation. So improvement in economic well-being in those areas actually reduces the conflict. Now, one thing that caught my eyes, they mentioned too, when they include the tribal differences and when it comes to inclusion of dams and irrigation, they see tribal conflict increases. So again, the question is, if the increase in tribal conflict also can be one reason when they do have these conflicts over scarce resources when it comes to water, because we know dams create some other issues when it comes to the direction of water, where it goes and how much it goes. If that actually changing basically the attention, diverting the attention from the conflict from central government. My suggestion again is, when it comes to irrigation and introduction of dams, it's good to look at other issues, the negative aspects of dams that brings, especially when it comes to water issue, scarcity, conflict, not just domestic conflict among tribes in regard to water, also international conflict along the borders, how we are directing these waters using dams. When it comes to explanation, I would like to suggest to discuss more in depth when they discuss the opportunity cost of rebellion. And finally, the theoretical and empirical gap in the literature. Overall, in regard to the paper, I found the description of data is not very clear and straightforward. I would like to suggest to include an appendix to basically cover in details the description of data. I had to go back and forth in the paper to figure out how things are working, even they presented very well. And finally, when it comes to the time frame, variables, they need more explanations. When it comes to lag selection, again, the criteria, at least I couldn't find good explanation on that. And when it comes to explanation, just make sure all explanations, not just in regard to the conflict, all other variables you use is mainly on the significance, not just the signs. Basically, that's it, what I have. And I give the floor to presenters or to Shireen to conclude the session. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, let me just share. We are out of time. How do we want to proceed? Any suggestion? Anyone? Shireen? Jawad, Yasmin, Ali, would you like to add any notes, or do we want to conclude the session?
Well, let's get an opinion from Shireen, because I don't know if there's another panel that's starting. You know,
Yes.
Usually if the panel's time's over, we can all go. There was one question for our paper that I can very briefly address, but on the Q&A.
Shane?
Shireen,
So I am afraid it might be another session and she had to leave. Would you like me just conclude the session?
Maybe give the authors to respond to the comments. You know,
Yes,
maybe if I do anything.
with all means. Yes, please. Anyone? Jawad, would you like to discuss?
Yeah, let me just very briefly answer a question that Insan Tunali asked on Q&A.
I'm sorry, I got cut off. Hello?
Shireen, should we quit? The time is up. Should we quit?
No, please continue. I know you need to react to the comments raised, so please go ahead. Apologies for it running late, but I think it's worth doing it justice, so please go ahead.
Well, okay, good. Thank you for the comments. They were all very good, and I've taken notes. We'll address them, but I have no specific issues with them. So I'm just going to address the question that Dr. Tunali asked about the channels through which electrification affects literacy rates. Well, one broad answer is that electricity arriving in a village opens up opportunities. It develops the village, job opportunities develop, specifically in healthcare and in teaching that favor women. There's evidence from South Africa that electrification improves female employment. We don't have data, we haven't looked at this in the case of these villages, but I expect the arrival of electricity is doing that, opening prospects for these younger women. And some older women have gone to adult literacy, which was very popular in the 1980s and early 1990s, but then also schools opened up because of electricity. Fertility clinics were established that had an impact on fertility, as we had shown in an earlier paper. And what happens there is that it frees up women's time. You know, fertility in rural Iran was 8 births per woman in the early 1980s. and 15 years later, it was about 2. So you get a huge amount of time that's become available. This notion that rural people are now more of a citizen in the country. That was the motto of the revolution. So I suppose electricity was a confirmation of this big change and allowed or encouraged women to go to adult literacy classes or stay longer in school. And there's also this literature about study time. You know, if there's no electricity, the study time is very limited. And then the study time opens up, expands, it leads to more schooling. But then you think that is kind of neutral with respect to gender, that both boys and girls could take advantage of that. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Dr. Ida, do you want to request the second response?
Yes. If Ali or Yasmin is available, they would like to discuss. But Ali?
Yeah, sure. I can hop in here. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your comments. They were very useful and indeed aligned very closely with the comments I received from my supervisor. So you're clearly onto something. I got a question in the Q&A that I'll respond to briefly on the use of topography elevation as an instrument and the sort of possibility of a violation of the exclusion restriction in that case. We might expect elevation to be directly tied to conflict, especially in the Turkish context, because as people who are familiar with this conflict know, the PKK places many of its bases in the mountains in order to have sort of a topographical advantage over the Turkish government. So we might expect sort of greater amounts of conflict in higher up areas. And indeed, I do observe this in the full sample. But yeah, just something I didn't get around to mentioning in my presentation, which was that all of the instrumental variables, so all of the IV models exclude areas that are above 1,000 meters in elevation for precisely that reason. So the analysis is restricted to the agricultural lowlands of this area and excludes all of the mountainous regions that do sort of present this violation of the exclusion restriction. Then briefly on the comments regarding the effects of dams, the negative effects of dams. This is a very good point. And I think that could be a whole separate paper in and of itself, which is that this project in particular, obviously the farmers who receive irrigation speak very positively of it, but it's also extremely damaging for a whole lot of other people in the region, not least the people whose homes are flooded by the construction of these dams and the flooding caused by the reservoirs. Hasankeyf, one of the world's great sort of architectural heritage sites, one of the oldest sort of continuously inhabited human settlements, was flooded almost exactly this time last year by the completion of one of the final dams in this project, the Ilısu Dam. Strangely enough, this didn't make it into my paper. This was just sort of a personal curiosity of mine. But I looked at because I have this ballot box level election data, I thought it'd be interesting to interrogate sort of what the political responses were in areas that were being flooded. And strangely enough, Erdogan announced that he was building the Ilısu Dam, which would flood Hasankeyf in 2008. And somehow in every election since then, Hasankeyf has voted for the AKP almost without fail, which is kind of a puzzling result, because the head of the AKP states in no uncertain terms in 2008 that he's going to put your city underwater. And then for the subsequent 10 years, everyone keeps voting for him there. So I put a little blog post on my website about that in case anyone is interested in the deleterious effects of dams and the complex political economy in this region, where even some of the people who we would think of as being the main sort of losers in terms of this massive development project seem to somehow still support the government that's implementing it. And this is due to a host of reasons, including the fact that, you know, a lot of the people from this city and others that were flooded recognize that, you know, first of all, they're being relocated, so they have new housing built for them, but they also sort of accept the trade-off that, you know, they're, you know, being moved to a new home, but they might also now receive electricity and increased sort of economic returns. So I mean, you flagged an extremely important and complex issue, which deserves its own full treatment that sadly I'm not able to you know, pay proper service to in this paper, but you do pick up on what is an extremely important facet of this whole project.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Professor Aida. The comments is really good, and we really appreciate it because it's a work in progress, and we are just expanding the project into a couple of papers. So we really appreciate your work and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's lovely. I think does Dina want to come in and just respond to the couple of questions raised, or is how would you like to proceed with that?
Actually, I just wrote my answer now because I felt that we're running out of time, but it was actually, I guess, one question. And thank you for the question. Maybe I didn't cover it in the presentation, but hinted on it indirectly. Yes, the question was regarding did the food crisis in 2008 helped in cushioning the impact of the COVID regarding the intensifying the value chains. Actually, yes, it helped, but not from this regard. It helped from indirectly through intensifying the food availability pillar, through provoking countries to increase their storage capacity at that time. Actually, since the food crisis in 2008, many countries, especially developing ones, started to follow this policy. So they were kind of ready with such kind of response, although it's bringing more pressure on the availability. Later, that would I would expect that later it would appear such kind of pressure, because it's not a sustainable kind of policy. And as we can see, the prices are turning to the upward direction. I guess one of the issues is due to because the pandemic is still ongoing, and the duration is not, no one can expect. So the pressure on the availability pillar, we cannot really say that it would last long, just to say. But the value chains, it's only the GCC countries showed, learned the lesson in this direction. They confronted the COVID with strong, robust value chains, highly linked with the international market, and having capital technology intensive ones that helped to a great deal, that helped them protect them to a great deal. That's my answer, and thank you for the question.
And unless any of the panelists or our kind discussants and moderators have something in mind, I think we would be ready to close.
Thank you.
Okay, what remains is a very, very, very special thank you to Dr. Atif Kobrosi, Dr. Aida Mirzai, and to each and every one of the panelists, Dina, Mandur, Yasmin on behalf of her colleagues, Javad Salehi, Ali Ballinger. We're really grateful for a very rich session. Hoda will be in touch very soon with the discussants' comments and the request to take it fully on board so that we can it can be submitted for the working paper series. And given the very rich discussion that took place today, I would really like to also invite you to consider submitting an article, a policy article for the forum. It helps immensely with extending the outreach of the work, and invite you to actually join us for the next couple of weeks at 4 o'clock with your coffee for other ERF sessions. I'm really sorry, but I actually see Dr. Insan Tonali with a hand raised, so I wouldn't be able to disconnect without allowing him the space if he'd like to have it. Dr. Insan? Hello?
Hi, I got lost contact and reappeared. I was able to fire away my questions from the Q&A box and they were answered. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Then thank you all, and have a lovely evening after this very rich discussion.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.